Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
If every allegation of historic child abuse was true, life would be easy for the police. If every allegation was false, it would be similarly straightforward to handle cases. In reality, some cases turn out to be genuine, while others are not. Now, last night, you might have seen the BBC Panorama programme, a controversial programme criticised by the police, cast a sceptical eye over Operation Midland, the police investigation into allegations of sexual abuse and murder of children involving establishment figures. The programme pointed to holes in the evidence of the small number of witnesses the police are relying on, and suggested that having paid too little attention to victims of child abuse over the years, the police had now become too credulous of all claims. Newsnight has learned today that the current caseload of current child abuse and related corruption cases could take 10 years to clear. Here's our investigations editor, Nick Hopkins.
Policing the past. Who to believe and who not to. A daunting challenge for today's detectives. Today, retired Bishop Peter Ball jailed for child abuse.
Any message for the victims?
Well, I'm always very, very, very sorry.
He was a friend of the royals, of judges. With their backing, he escaped justice 20 years ago. They couldn't help him today. But as he was sentenced, a row over last night's BBC Panorama. The programme cast doubt on a current high-profile case involving VIPs in alleged child abuse and murder. The truth is, the police are being deluged by claims of abuse and by claims of cover-up. Some of the allegations they look at are, frankly, incredible. But then so was the offending of Jimmy Savile and his escape from justice. The police officers I've spoken to simply don't know who to believe, and they dare not rule anything out. And here's one of the reasons why.
With every passing day, with every new revelation, it is clear that the sexual abuse of children has taken place and is still taking place on a scale that we still cannot fully comprehend.
Do you think the police are being overwhelmed by these current cases?
I think they would be overwhelmed if they investigated every single lead that they had, and the Chief Constable of Norfolk, Simon Bailey, who is the lead police officer in the country on these matters, told me when I was a minister that if they investigated every lead they were given, the police would do nothing else at all. That's how many potential leads they've got. I mean, clearly they can't investigate everything, so they need to prioritise those which are most serious and which are ongoing and potentially affect children being abused today.
And this is at the heart of arguments currently going on within the Met itself. It has 27 officers investigating those claims of VIP abuse and murder at Dolphin Square 30-odd years ago. Some have whispered they think the inquiry is going nowhere. Others insist they must go on. There are no easy choices and lots of mixed signals. But the police aren't just dealing with what alleged victims say. There's claims of cover-up too. 29 alleged cases of police corruption linked to claims of child abuse between the 1970s and 2000s are currently being investigated. They involve allegations of suppressing evidence, hindering or halting investigations, and covering up the offences because of the involvement of members of Parliament and police officers. The Independent Police Complaints Commission says,
"The majority of the investigations stem from allegations made by retired Metropolitan Police officers."
One of them involves claims revealed by Newsnight. We reported allegations an inquiry that found Cyril Smith abusing boys at flats in South London was abandoned.
So this means you've got former police officers, very reliable witnesses, coming forward and saying that they were told to close down investigations into child abuse. It doesn't get more serious than that. That is exceptionally significant, and we can't ignore that fact. So we're not just relying on alleged victims, we're also relying on documentary evidence, but most importantly, we're relying on allegations being made by former police officers. It's very significant.
In an ideal world, somewhere in the bowels of Scotland Yard, there's a file marked cover-ups. But cover-ups don't work like that, if indeed there were any, which is why privately detectives at Scotland Yard say it will take 10 years to clear the backlog of cases they already have. Separating the credible from the incredible, the facts from fantasy, the job has only just begun.
Nick Hopkins there. Now, there is one group involved in exposing allegations of historical abuse. It was extensively mentioned in the Panorama last night, and it's an investigative reporting unit called Exaro. It's brought some of the key witnesses forward. It has published numerous allegations on its website. So if there are doubts over some of the key witnesses helping police in Operation Midland, there are then also doubts, potential doubts, about the weight Exaro has put on their testimony. And I'm joined by Mark Watts, Editor-in-Chief of Exaro. Good evening. So in many respects, you are one of the key players instigating much of what's going on in Operation Midland.
Well, yes, but I think it's important to say that you kind of set it up at the beginning as a sort of very much a binary debate, as it were, one side or the other. Is it all true? Is it all false? And I think there's a bit of a problem with that. First of all, it's inevitably going to be more complicated than that. I think the reality will be more complicated than that. But there's another problem, which is the warning that was made by the Solicitor General, who actually said we shouldn't be trying to determine whether it's true or false, because that would be to prejudge the allegations that are being investigated by the police, and that's not on, as he warned.
Right. Well, look, I'm actually interested in the journalism behind bringing some of these cases forward and whether appropriate amounts of checks and such like have been done. Can we look at, I'm not going to mention names of particular witnesses or anything like that. I don't want to bring them into it. But in the case of one, there was a lot of cannot be corroborated, can it? Because it's things that have happened in private and you're never going to find out or corroborate. But there are some things witnesses say to you that can be corroborated. And in the case of one of the witnesses, there was an event, a murder, that occurred on a street, a hit and run in Kingston. Did you try and corroborate whether that had happened? Because Panorama could find no evidence it had happened. They didn't think it had happened.
Well, that does kind of raise this great difficulty about sort of investigating the evidence that is subject to criminal investigation. But I think I can help in this way. We obviously do receive a lot of allegations and we test their credibility, and we certainly don't publish all that comes into us. And in this particular case, we did regard the allegations as credible, and actually we regarded it as credible for reasons that we haven't gone into. Not just the strength of the apparent credibility of the witness. And it wasn't in the end just Exaro, of course, that came to that judgment. In the end, the police made that assessment.
But did you check that murder, that hit had occurred? A child had died on a street in Kingston at a particular time, as your witness had said. Because obviously, if it didn't occur, as Panorama could find no evidence it had, that would cast doubt on whether the witness was reliable or not, and whether it was worth publishing that witness's statement on your website.
Well, we certainly did make checks so far as
And did you
was
find
possible.
the same as Panorama, that there was no evidence that it occurred?
Well, as I say, we have a real problem about basically saying, is a witness telling the truth or lying?
No, but it's interesting, isn't it, before you publish a thing, to know whether bits of the story that you can corroborate, if those don't stack up, then you might have doubts on the bits that you can't corroborate. And I'm just wondering whether you had done that check and nevertheless published or not.
We did look very closely at what the claims were from that particular witness, and I suppose the main focus went on other alleged murders because they involved
the ones that couldn't be corroborated, rather than the one that could be corroborated and which had no evidence for it, no other evidence.
Well, I'm hampered here because I can't go into the evidence. There's an awful lot we haven't published.
I sense your frustration, but we're hampered too, because we're all trying to come to judgments. We read your website, and then we're trying to come to a judgment. But of course, you haven't really told us whether we should believe what you know, and maybe it's not the right thing to publish.
And it's not the right thing to do. And it's clear it's not the right thing to do because the Solicitor General has told us all
let's move on to
we
another
shouldn't be prejudging.
Did you know that one of the witnesses to whom you were giving some publicity had previous convictions for hoaxing and making false confessions?
Well, I have already said that we are not going to go into the detail of particularly vulnerable witnesses who are under enormous pressure And I think you do.
I understand.
You are
I don't want to
aware of
name.
the reasons for that.
I'm really not.
I think it's obvious who we'd be talking about, so I don't want to expand on.
But I think it is interesting. It's relevant for us to know whether you knew that when you published, and whether you didn't disclose it when you published his testimony, or whether you didn't know.
What I will say is that the police have actually said that they totally believed what this witness was saying, and so, again, it was a credible witness. Making allegations that the police regarded as worth investigating and that they believed were worth investigating.
But with respect, we're trying to work out whether you and the police have overreacted. That's the whole proposition.
We are in
is that you're believing people who shouldn't be believed. It is relevant to the fact that you published this and the police's assessment of it, that this person had, a record of dishonesty and previous convictions for making false confessions. Now, we're obviously talking about vulnerable people, whether they're false memories or whether they're victims of abuse. There's going to be a great deal of vulnerability, so we need to be very sensitive. But I'm focusing on your journalism. Would you publish, in general, an allegation made by somebody who you knew had a record of, say, false confessions?
Well, no, and
you wouldn't.
No, as a matter of principle, we wouldn't do that. But it's worth observing that abuse survivors often, but not always, often do have very troubled pasts, which might involve, for example, drug taking. It might involve committing crimes. And I think it's important to recognise that actually the weight of the evidence is not just relying on abuse survivors. And in a sense, what Panorama did last night was focus entirely on abuse survivors and completely ignored all the police officers, former police officers, I should say, who have come forward to make claims of closed operations that were not pursuing the evidence on VIPs.
Right, no, well, that's a different set of issues. But I'm interested in your website, really. Were you aware that one witness, the same witness, had written an email telling a social worker, Leon Britton never abused me or anyone I know?
We were not aware of that, and we do not know if such an email exists.
Well, I've got a copy of it here. I'm probably going to take too long to read it.
But the thing is, I have said that we are not going into detail at the moment about abuse survivors who are particularly vulnerable, and I think you are aware of the particular vulnerabilities, and I think it's unfair on them to sort of put even more pressure on them than already exists.
Have you changed your mind about whether it's appropriate to keep up on your website any testimony as a result of what you've seen on Panorama?
We haven't come to that view, no. And it's very important to recognise that Operation Midland, which is the major, I suppose, the operation that's taken most attention, actually only happened as a consequence of evidence that we found. And at the end of the day, the police have made the assessment, they agreed with us that it was credible, and despite all the reporting that says that it's on the brink of collapse, they've repeated that. So they said it back in December of last year that it was credible. They added the word true, to some controversy indeed, and they've repeated the point that these are credible allegations, credible evidence, which warrants having 27 officers investigating those claims.
Did your group at any point try to stop people taking part, your witnesses, so to speak? Did you try to dissuade them from talking to Panorama?
No, that was something that Panorama did ask us. We were often consulted by abuse survivors who were getting approached, being doorstepped in various ways. There were several abuse survivors who approached us in these circumstances, and we knew that Panorama had a predetermined view on the issue, so our advice was that it probably might be in their interest not to participate. But we certainly weren't telling them anything. We would always stress, you have to be very careful with abuse survivors, that it was their choice ultimately.
So no one from Exaro warned an alleged victim that if he spoke to Panorama, he could face legal action and possibly lose his job, that kind of...
No, that's complete nonsense. I mean, Panorama did put that to us. I don't think it was in the programme, but we asked them, well, who was the person who called? I mean, it would have to have been done on my authority. I'm the editor of Exaro, and that simply hasn't happened for anybody, abuse survivor or not.
Now, you ran a story about a rape allegation against Leon Britton. Police did investigate that. They interviewed Leon Britton as a result of the witness that you put forward. They didn't proceed with that against Leon Britton. Do you regret the distress caused to him and his family at the end of his life, the late Leon Britton?
Well, there's been a lot of misreporting here. Jane's allegations were also taken as very, very seriously by the police. And actually the police initially failed to follow their own guidelines, which is to interview the suspect under caution until we reported the case. They were already investigating, and we reported that they were failing to take the action that they did. As a consequence of our report, Tom Watson wrote to the DPP, who also thought it was very odd the police were not interviewing the suspect under caution. That duly happened, and even at the point of his death, the police were still investigating that case, and indeed other cases.
The police have apologised to Leon Britton's family. Have you considered doing that?
We haven't, and I haven't seen the letter that the Met has apparently sent to the widow. But we do know that they were continuing to investigate the allegation of rape involving a woman who was called Jane, and they were also investigating, of course, under Operation Midland, for example, allegations of child sex abuse against Lord Britton.
No doubts about anything you've done?
No doubts about presenting the evidence as we found it, credible evidence, which the police also have treated as credible.
Mark Watts, thank you very much indeed.
If you